for coming. We really appreciate you attending the third of our 4 World Press Freedom Festival panels. I'm joined by Jaya Patak from, yet again, as most of you will know, I'm from the Demographica Network, and today we're going to be talking about challenges to press freedom and whistleblowing journalism. So I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to hopefully see our presentation. As you can see, whistleblowing journalism and challenges to press freedom is our topic for today. I'm going to pass you over to Jaya, who's going to be taking you through the first section, and then I'll take you through the second section, and we'll have some questions at the end. So Jaya, off you go.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thanks to all who are watching. So we're going to be talking a little bit about whistleblowing journalism and press freedom, as Jack has said. And one case study that I think is really important for us to look at is the BBC. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But just to begin with, it's no surprise that yet again, Demographica have been involved in campaigning for Uyghur rights. And, you know, we've been really vocal about our work there. And the BBC have done remarkable reporting about what's going on to the Uyghurs. And their work really has underpinned a lot of what we know and has helped prompt a response out of the UK government, because they're able to see the realities and the truth of what's going on. However, as we know with China, it's a communist country. There are major issues with press freedom. So just to begin with and give you a little bit of context, China currently ranks 171 out of 180 countries in the world in the 2021 World Press Freedom Index. That's a shocking statistic. China is one of the most powerful nations in the world. We have so much dependency on China. We have a trading relationship, an economic relationship, and so forth. And normally people have a connotation that restricted press freedom isn't for those countries. You know, how can we possibly be engaging with countries who are so restrictive? But it's a reality. And why this is based on a number of areas. Of course, most obviously, China's state and privately owned media are under the Communist Party's tight control. And that's really obvious, we know that. But we've seen that Chinese authorities have tightened their grip on news and information even more since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So these issues were always there. They've simply been accelerated and aggravated, and the world are more aware of the issues that are presented. As the pandemic emerged, a Chinese doctor who actually whistleblew and was one of the first doctors from China who told us about what was happening with coronavirus was reprimanded, and his efforts by the Chinese government were smeared, and he was essentially really given a bad name for doing what he did. And the Chinese government went to such extreme lengths to hide and conceal the truth about coronavirus in many aspects. And this is news that we've known about. But that's in one aspect, and that's quite close to home, because, you know, when you're dealing with a pandemic, you need to have open dialogue, candid dialogue, and that's obviously what we didn't have. However, press freedom has been under threat in China for years before that. And we've seen it in Tibet, we've seen it happening to the Uyghurs, we've seen it happening in Hong Kong. And, you know, particularly focusing on sort of the statistics, at the time of the 2021 World Press Freedom Index publication, 7 journalists were still being held for their coverage of the pandemic. More than 450 social media users were briefly arrested for sharing false rumours about the virus. That's a shocking statistic. Social media is our free space. You know, you're not a journalist just because you tweet something. You're not advocating for anything necessarily because you say the facts or you share information about what's happening, but that's obviously not how it's seen under the Chinese government's eyes. In 2021, China continues to be the world's biggest jailer of press freedom defenders, with more than 120 currently detained. And often they are detained in unimaginable conditions and conditions that pose a threat to their life. So it's really twofold, and it's a worsening situation. And to sort of give an idea of the types of individuals that are detained or jailed, we had a leading media source of information about Tibet who died in February 2021 as a result of mistreatment in prison. We had a Nobel Peace Laureate and winner of the RSF Press Freedom Prize and a dissident blogger jailed in and died in 2017 as well. With the use of technology, the president Xi Jinping, him and his regime are able to impose such draconian, awful social media control, and that isn't just based on news. It's also based, like I said, on Twitter, on information that people are putting out, and they're able to do this because of that control they have, but also because they have online surveillance of their citizens, and we know about the surveillance issues in China. We've seen it in the Tibetan region and the Uyghur region, but you are not safe, and everything that you do is tracked. And just to give you an extent of the surveillance that occurs in the Uyghur region, Uyghurs have said, and people who have lived in the Uyghur region, when I say Uyghur region, by the way, I'm referring to Xinjiang, have said that they have experienced being tracked and being monitored as far as how much petrol they fill in their car, or which petrol stations they oh, sorry, my chair fell, which petrol stations they drop off at. And ultimately, that's quite a terrifying concept, because if you can just imagine, that's a daily occurrence, right? That's us literally going to the shops or going to do our everyday things, and that's quite terrifying to think. So that's the extent to which surveillance occurs, and it's quite terrifying. At the same time, Beijing are trying to export their oppressive model by promoting a new world media order under China's influence. And the administration creates more and more obstacles for foreign reporters, and that's where we move on to the BBC. So when we look at the Uyghurs, the BBC have done incredible reporting, and in October 2018, the team led by John Sudworth released an article discussing the hidden camps in China. And Jack, I think on the next slide, we've got a few points as well that we can look at. So in December 2020, they also released news on the tainted cotton of China, and this talks about the facts and figures related to slavery and Chinese forced labor. Again, to give you numbers to work with, 20% of the world's cotton comes from comes from China. And in China, 80% of their cotton comes from the Uyghur region. And we know that Uyghurs are being used in forced labor. So this was, again, groundbreaking. And in February 2021, the BBC team released an explosive piece on allegations of rape and torture that are occurring in these re-education camps, concentration camps in the Uyghur region. And these brave Uyghur women who testified were subject to smears by the Chinese government. Really unthinkable stuff happened as a result of it. But this does bring into question the response of the Chinese government. Why would they be going to such lengths to hide something if there was nothing to hide? And why would they be reacting this way if there was nothing to react to? Again, looking at the BBC as an institution, the BBC have authority all around the world. They are by far one of the most popular English language news sites in the world, and they are trusted by people on all sides of the political spectrum, again, globally. They are highly accessible. You can consume the content from BBC News all around the world in different languages with multiple services. They've got a good reputation, and they're also fairly accurate as well. Ofcom research, as in this PowerPoint, found that the two words most associated with the BBC were trust and accuracy. That's remarkable for any news agency around the world as well. But this does sort of pose a question of, how safe are journalists, and are there threats to them personally? And initially, a lot of people said, well, we know that there's restrictions to press freedom because it occurs, and we know that it's going to be an issue because we have a communist party who are in power. However, that doesn't mean anything, because people kept saying, well, does that mean that we have threats to press freedom? Do journalists themselves face threats? And after many, many years of people saying that that's not the case, we know it is the case. And that's where we're going to move on to talking a little bit about John Sudworth and his experience at the BBC. And yeah, as you can see, again, these are examples of, the types of evidence and footage we got from BBC's reports. So John Sudworth has led the team, and he has been in China for 9 years on behalf of the BBC. He had to move to Taiwan after threats to his and his family's safety as a result of all of the reports he had done. And this happened, I think it was towards end of March, April time, where he had to leave. And that's remarkable. In the 9 years he's been there, he finally took the decision to leave. And that's quite a terrifying thing to think about. He is a British journalist who's out there, and he's still under threat. In February this year, China actually banned the BBC from broadcasting following their reports on COVID and the Uyghurs. And that in itself, again, shows that they have something to hide. They don't like the work that BBC are doing. Additionally, the number of international media organizations that are reporting from China is dwindling. And last year, China expelled correspondents for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, amongst many, many others. What this does mean is we know that press freedom is under threat. We know that it's happening to British journalists, the BBC, reputable, trustworthy, reliable source of information. What does this mean for the future of journalism and media? What does this mean for regional, independent and smaller outlets if one of the biggest in the world has come under threat? Should there be international repercussions for these kind of threats? And can sources on the ground be kept safe? When it comes to whistleblowing journalism, which Jack will talk about in a second, we rely heavily on the news that we get about atrocity and genocide, which is what Yet Again is based on, from our whistleblowing reporting. Without our whistleblowing journalists and our journalists in general, we would not know what's going on in the ground all across the world. That has been the truth and it will continue to be. So that's what we have to really start thinking about. And the BBC News getting banned by the Chinese government may not have been surprising, but it was certainly shocking. And it's actually a crazy thing to even contemplate. So that's where we look at the case study of the BBC. What can we learn from that, and how much more can we do to protect our journalists and our free press? Not just British free press, but free press all across the world. Jack, feel free to.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Jo. Really, really interesting, really insightful. I think the BBC is such a fantastic case study in this area, because particularly in this country at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about the work that the BBC does, a lot of attacks on the BBC as an institution, but fundamentally, this is the sort of groundbreaking work that the BBC do, reporting these issues in such a simplistic, digestible, and easy to access way that has really changed the way that we discuss the Uyghur genocide. And I think that there's particularly a lot of limitations to the work that the BBC does, but like you rightly say, if the largest news organization in the world, one of the most trusted and well-recognized news organizations in the world, can't work in the region now, what are then the repercussions when we're looking at press freedom to journalists or reporters who are on the ground in China? And I think that this is something that looking at what we can take away from this week, we need to do a little bit more awareness raising on, because I think that it's a real worry when we're not going to be able to be getting the trustworthy and reliable news that we've been getting from the BBC. Okay, so I wanted to talk through whistleblowing, and whistleblowing to me is probably, in my view, one of the most important forms of reporting, one of the most important forms of journalism, because it serves the key purpose of journalism to me, and that is to speak truth to power and to report what is in the public interest. And we'll go through some individual cases of whistleblowers and the repercussions of the actions that they've taken. But what we're looking at is one of the most courageous forms of reporting that you can possibly do. Now, let's do a bit of contextualization first. Where does the phrase whistleblowing or blowing the whistle come from? Whistleblowing has existed throughout history, and I think that there are lots of cases that we can look at. One of the first and most notable cases was during Ivan the Terrible's regime, where one of his close friends defected to Lithuania and began to tell the stories of what Ivan was doing in Russia. And what it means essentially is an individual who is exposing some kind of wrongdoing within an organization or a country or a business, usually a government organization, but not always, and sharing information that's in the public interest. Traditionally, whistleblowing has come with huge risks, and often whistleblowers are persecuted after they've blown the whistle. With the changes in technology and the different kinds of reporting that we can see globally, those threats are changing, and it's getting easier and easier to pass on information anonymously through different channels. However, the risks to whistleblowers still remain, and oftentimes we don't see things reported far after they've occurred because the threats to these individuals have been so large. So I wanted to highlight a few cases of whistleblowing journalism that have been really impactful. Now, this fine-looking gentleman in the bottom left-hand corner is a man named Edmund Dean Morel. He was a shipping clerk who worked in Britain and in the Congo Free State that was at the time colonized by the Belgian King Leopold II. Now, when he was working in the Congo Free State, he saw the atrocities that were being that were being committed to the Congolese people, the slavery that was occurring, and was one of the first people to organize a network of individuals who reported on what was happening inside the Congo Free State. Now, this information at the time was groundbreaking. This was a Western individual who was going completely against the grain to report on something that many people still saw at the time to be acceptable. His campaigning and the subsequent campaign after his writings led to the Congo Free State being annexed to the Belgian government from King Leopold II. So his work led to movements all around the world that would increase decolonization and independence for lots of countries. But also Morel spent a lot of time in Congo after the state was annexed, working within the region to ensure that the people gained control, that it was safe, and that the atrocities ended. The organization that he formed wasn't disbanded until 1913, so he spent quite a lot of time there. Interestingly enough, Morel went on to become a Labour MP, and he actually unseated Winston Churchill in an election in, I believe, 1917. After his time as a Labour politician, he worked on lots of different, uncovering lots of different stories of atrocities in Africa, and led pacifist and anti-slavery movements around the world that got him imprisoned. And that time in prison, unfortunately, the impacts to his health led to his death. Next up, some examples that are a bit more contemporary that you might be aware of. First up, we have Chelsea Manning. Now, Chelsea Manning was a US Army soldier who was convicted by the US government after violating the Espionage Act, which stops people from spreading secrets from within the US that might give their opponents in a war or diplomatically an upper hand. Now, Chelsea Manning released 750,000 documents to the organization WikiLeaks, which was, and I believe still is, headed up by Julian Assange. Most of those convicted under the Espionage Act are whistleblowers, and I think one of the most interesting aspects of whistleblowing journalism and the impact to the persecution, I would say, of whistleblowing journalists is that after they are imprisoned, after they are forced to flee their country, after oftentimes they are killed, they are cleared. You know, that it is shown that they've done nothing wrong. Most people who have been convicted of the Espionage Act latterly have had their sentences rescinded, or they've been allowed back into the country, or campaigns have been started to show that they've done nothing wrong. Now, the reason that I've selected Chelsea Manning is because there's two instances of documents that she released that have been particularly impactful on me, but I think are important to discuss in a wider context of it not just being information from dictatorships that needs to be spread, but also from within democracies, countries that we would see as being flourishing Western democracies. Now, the first of the videos that Chelsea Manning, the first of the documents that Chelsea Manning shared was the 2007 Baghdad strike. Now, this video showed US soldiers inside a helicopter killing at least 12 civilians, 2 of which were journalists, and then laughing about the killings that they had just conducted afterwards. This is one of the most impactful of Chelsea Manning's documents. This week we've been celebrating press freedom and remembering journalists who have been killed and persecuted around the world. And maybe something we haven't touched on enough is the West's impact on press freedom globally. Now, this is an example of 2 journalists on the ground who were murdered by the US military. Let's not forget that Chelsea Manning, for releasing this information, which is obviously in the public interest, was arrested and sentenced to 35 years in prison for this. The second video shows a 2009 airstrike in Afghanistan that killed between 90 and 140 people, almost all of which were civilians, and at least 20 of which were children. So this is how impactful Chelsea Manning's leaks were, and how important her whistleblowing was to show the world exactly the acts that were being perpetrated by the US military. As I said, that she was sentenced to 35 years in prison after she pled guilty to the charges. She had her sentence commuted by President Barack Obama to 7 years, so from the time she was charged to 2017, and was released in 2017. After the fact, she has been subject to all sorts of campaigns where people have argued that she should be re-imprisoned. She could have faced the death penalty for leaking the information that she did. So it's not that Chelsea Manning has been released from prison and is now heralded as a hero. She is still very much under attack, much like the next individual who I'm going to be speaking about, Edward Snowden. I'm sure you've all heard of, and I'll flick through this information about Edward Snowden quickly so we can get to our discussion. But Edward Snowden released a plethora of information after working as a contractor for the CIA, and released information about NSA and Five Eyes intelligence agency work to create surveillance programs alongside European governments and telecoms companies that would track the information of citizens, much like, not dissimilar to what Jay was talking about, that happens now to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And Edward Snowden, after leaking this information, was charged under the same act as Chelsea Manning and was forced to flee. He fled to Russia, where he still lives to this day. He's been given permanent residency in Russia. Edward Snowden still argues that these programs that he uncovered are not only weren't stopped, but have become more sophisticated as time has gone on. So I think that this is an example of possibly whistleblowing not doing the job that it was intended to do. We know about this information now, but nothing was done to stop the surveillance programs that Edward Snowden uncovered. And if anything, they've just become more sophisticated. We know that our phones are listening to us, and oftentimes the information that we put out into the world isn't able to be deleted. We're tracked. The information that we give off into the internet is tracked at a far deeper level than we can possibly understand. Interestingly enough, I think with Edward Snowden's case, and this is similar to what I was saying about Chelsea Manning, the federal court found that the surveillance program that Edward Snowden uncovered was illegal and possibly unconstitutional, possibly being an interesting word. It was almost definitely unconstitutional. Edward Snowden hasn't been welcomed back into the United States with open arms. He hasn't been heralded as a hero by US governments. He is seen by some as a patriot and of doing an act that should be heralded, and he should be heralded as a hero. But often by many, he is seen as being somebody who has committed an act that he should be imprisoned for and never be allowed back into the United States for. So I'd be interested to know. I'd be interested to throw it over to Jay and see what your thoughts are on these cases of whistleblowing journalism, but also to hear if anybody has any thoughts about these acts, the way that we should look at whistleblowing journalism. Is there any legislation or regulation that we could introduce to protect these journalists, or should they not be protected? Does anybody think that possibly they're doing something that is wrong, and they are breaking the law, and people like Edward Snowden being cast away into Russia was the right thing to do? So Gerald, I'll throw it over to you first.
Yeah, I mean, you summarized it really well. It's really quite complicated because, to an extent, you look at the law and where they're breaking the law, but actually, is what they're doing for the greater good of the people. And obviously in Edward Snowden's case, like you pointed out, it didn't really have a happy ending. Nothing was done with the information that we found out about. But I think there is something to say about having discussions around protection, and whistleblowing journalism. Is it only okay when it's in favor of what a government wants? Is it never okay when it's almost looks like it's against a government? And I think all of these are very plausible things to think about, and I do believe that we do need to do better to protect our whistleblowing journalists, especially at a time where we are, like we have said this whole week, when the free press are under threat, then we are left sort of with no other option, right? Otherwise, how else are we meant to know what's going on? And in that light, things might have been different 10, 15 years ago, but knowing that, what could governments be doing? And how can we protect our journalists and you know, whistleblowing journalism has been life-changing in so many ways. We've seen it across the spectrum, and it will continue to be. I can't see it not playing a part in atrocity awareness, which is obviously what we focus on yet again. So it'll be really interesting to see, you know, how this develops, and how we continue to engage with countries who are posing threats to the free press. You know, for example, the UK-China relationship, it's unimaginable. And, you know, the government spoke greatly about what had gone on to, you know, the BBC, and, you know, it's a lot of rhetoric, but how do we back that rhetoric up? Because clearly the words aren't enough. They're not seen as as holding much weight, because the Chinese government don't take it seriously. That in itself is a massive problem too. So I don't know the way necessarily to go forward. I do think there needs to be protection. I do think that what the world has to accept that this will be more of the case. It will continue. Whistleblowing journalism is not going to stop. It's only going to increase. But it's interesting to know what you think. Like, do you think the government, like, do you have any ideas for how government could regulate things?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I think it's interesting to, and it was one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the presentation, particularly with the case studies, was whistleblowing journalism is always great when somebody's blowing the whistle against your enemy, right? So if somebody blows the whistle against Russia, if we have a dissident from Russia, and they're talking about things that the Russian government are doing, somebody like the gentleman on the far right of the page at the moment is a man named Sergei Magnitsky. Magnitsky sanctions are named after him, and he uncovered corruption within the Russian state. Now, Sergei Magnitsky is a hero, like, in my opinion, all of these whistleblowing journalists are, and is somebody that has been heralded as such in this country. And it's great when it's against the Russian state. However, when you know, you have somebody who uncovers secrets within the United Kingdom, for example, a former MI6 spy who uncovers that the MI6 are unduly investigating politicians around the world who have socialist views. They're seen as, they're persecuted, they're arrested, they're thrown in prison on bizarre charges, then released. They have gagging orders against them. So I think that it's important that we are aware of our position and our role, that the role that we play as a country and that we play in the West towards the persecution of journalists around the world, and that we don't get too readily on our high horse about what other countries are doing. That being said, there is persecution and there's persecution, and obviously we need to lead by example and fight for the rights of journalists around the world. I think that particularly when we're looking at the UK-China relation, my view is that we shouldn't be dealing with states who actively act against things that we hold dear. Take the Saudi state, for example, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In my opinion, we shouldn't be dealing with the Saudi state. We should not be dealing with a state who is readily who is ready to murder a journalist fairly openly. I think that that's my position on it. It's a staunch one, but I think that if we truly want to uphold those values, that's the way in which we have to do so. If anyone's got anything to add, please feel free to either use the raise hand function or to put a question in the chat box. I can't actually see it. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I might be able to see the chat box if anyone has any questions. It doesn't look like we do. So yeah, please do. I mean, Jay, when we're looking at those instances, particularly the Chelsea Manning instance, that is one that stuck with me. Do you think that states like the US possibly have gotten off too lightly with some of the acts that they've, some of the ways in which they've treated whistleblowing journalists or journalists in general?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it's sort of like you have to uphold your values, right? You know, if you are a country or a government and you preach all of these things about human rights, and you're always talking about how, you know, this is the free world, we stand for X, Y, Z things, but you treat your own journalists in a deplorable way, you know, what does that say? Instead of looking in the mirror and taking a hard look at yourself and thinking, right, why are we in this position? Why did someone feel the need to do this at great risk to themselves? They know it's going to be at great risk. instead of addressing that situation, it becomes a case of, we are always right and they are in the wrong. And treating something like that isn't favourable. And slowly, more and more people are going to be of the opinion that it's not favourable. And they're going to, it leads to distrust. It leads to just simply not thinking that your government have your back, or that they're reliable, or that you can, trust the information coming out of them. And that's where you give rise to bigger problems and wider problems as well. So I do think that, they do get off quite lightly. And I like your point about holding other countries up to the standards at which you preach. And it's an ideal way to look at things, but there's nothing wrong with being optimistic. Ultimately, could we get to a stage in life where we look at our relationships with these countries who don't have any regard for their press or for freedom of speech, let alone, genocidal states when we're talking about China. So it's a long way to go. The geopolitics of it is always going to be complicated, whether we like it or not, but it's about having these conversations and opening up people to those discussions as well. So you can only hope that with time that changes. But I think it's quite interesting actually to talk a little bit about sort of, where does the BBC go from here now?
Yeah.
Are all their reporters just going to be in Taiwan reporting about events in China? And will we get to a point where there are no foreign correspondents in China? You never want to be pessimistic, but there is a crackdown that's happening. It's increasing. And you would think it would be enough to raise the flag. They clearly have something to worry about, but
Yep.
I don't know. I wonder where the BBC will sit on this and how they'll continue to do the work that they're doing. And I'm sure they will, and I know they are. But it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because it's quite a terrifying thing, thinking that, everything your life is dedicated to is under threat. His family were followed. He was followed. It's horribly as children. His wife was also based in China as well. So it's an unimaginable situation to be in. And you often think that, this is happening to the BBC. What is going to happen to independent organisations, smaller organisations who don't have governments to speak out on their behalf? Is there a coalition that should be made? Is there a forum that should be had? Is there legislation that should be passed to protect journalists in light of situations like this happening again in China and other countries? Probably there is license for it. It's very difficult though to prompt the governments to do that, because they don't want to anger countries like China.
No, and I think that you make a really good point. I'm going to bring Hamish in a second, but what I wanted to say from that is one of the reasons I think it's so important to hold conversations about whistleblowing journalists and the protections that we could give them is because in places like China, we may be left in a situation where the only way we can get information is through people blowing the whistle. If there are no journalists, international journalists left, if there are no journalists from places like the BBC, the only way that we can get information is from those brave Chinese citizens or those brave individuals from inside China who are willing to speak out. One of the cases that we spoke about from history was a gentleman named Li Zhensheng, who was a photographer, took around 20,000 photographs during Mao's Cultural Revolution, hid them under his floorboards, and then published them in the 1980s. That's one of the best accounts that we've got of Mao's regime. Are cases like this going to be the only way that in years in the future that we can tell stories or find out what's really going on? And that's what I worry about. Hamish, thanks so much for joining the conversation. What is it that you wanted to say?
No worries, man. I just want to say, first of all, really good presentation, both of you. Really, really good, really insightful. So thank you for doing that. My question, because I think, Jaya, you really hit a really good point about having like a forum about this kind of issue with like the BBC being sort of taken out of China, but like going away from Taiwan. And would you say maybe like could international organizations help? For example, like the United Nations and other sort of organizations that try and defend press freedom, could they are there any ways of kind of getting involved in that sense? Because I'm not totally clued up in the situation, but just wondering if they could do something around protecting press freedom at all.
I think they should, and they could. If they will is another issue. The United Nations, when it comes to, I'll use China as an example, because obviously a lot of our work happens to be talking about the Uyghurs and other minorities affected by the Chinese government. They will be very open about their relationship, and they'll refuse to call China out, and there was a lot of issues around the pandemic and Taiwan and other issues. And so I don't have complete faith that they would be happy doing something like that. I do think that they could still get started on it and they could have it. Will we be in a similar situation to how the China interact with the United Nations now, where they hold a veto and they're not party to certain statutes and all of that stuff? Probably. But I mean, it offers some security to other countries and we have to start somewhere, right? So I do think there is a place for international organizations to do it. You know, or maybe independent bodies, maybe just remove ourselves from what there is now and create something new. That could also be quite promising. But we will have a hard time getting nations on board like China, like Saudi and all these other countries as well, because they know that they are going to be targets of what we're talking about. They know that they are, their way of working is under threat. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it does mean I think it makes it a lot harder, especially, again, it's the geopolitics of everything, always makes everything so complicated, and I wish it wasn't that complicated, but it is, and it's only going to increase. So maybe having an independent organisation do something like that already. The existing ones definitely have place to, and I think they should do it, but it's how you start that off, and it's looking at the problems that are already issues, what's already defunct, and then taking it from there. So in some ways it is easier to start from the ground up. And I think that there are organisations that are centred around media freedom and things like that who could lead the way, you know, almost act like a secretariat, how you do for an APPG, you know, organise, facilitate, and get things started. And even if you start just here in the UK, then maybe we can make that global. But it's possible to build these alliances. We've seen it happen before, it's happening now. It's just a case of having someone who's willing to do that and who has the expertise and knowledge to do it. I know, Jack, what you're thinking.
I think it's a really good question, Hamish, and I think it's something that organisations or institutions like the UN, whilst how much can they tangibly do, who really knows? You know, Joe outlined really well the limitations of the UN in so many ways, but the just having conversations, just showing, you know, that this is something that they're aware of and it's something that they want to do, first of all highlights the issue. I think individual countries need to stand stronger and stand firmer in these areas. I think, like I said, I would like to see the UK, for example, take a stronger stance against countries who openly persecute journalists or are against press freedom. I think that instead of journalists being scared of reporting stories, we need regimes being scared of persecuting journalists. I think that's the way around it needs to be. One of the things that I didn't say about Edward Snowden is that he's the president of something called the Freedom of the Press Association, which works exactly to these ends. It works to highlight and support journalists who are talking about hacking and security issues and ensure that they're safe to do so, supporting them to do their work, which is great. And we need more organizations like that. And I think it's something that we wanted to get from this week is starting to have conversations around what the issues are. Let's talk about individuals who have worked in this field. Let's talk to experts in the area who are talking about issues that are currently ongoing and figuring out where we can place ourselves to be able to do our bit to uphold press freedom, not just in this country but globally. But no, I think you're totally right, and I think that institutions like the UN, in my view, there's so many examples where press freedom hasn't been upheld or where atrocities or human rights have been able to be abused, that it's a failure of these institutions to stop that. It's what they were started for, and the fact that this is becoming more and more of an occurrence, the fact that it's getting closer and closer to home, it just highlights that even more. I don't know, maybe that's something that can come from this week is us working more in this sense throughout the year. I know that was something that we wanted to work on, Jer. So I mean, I was going to ask you just to come back to the China issue, because I know you've got such expertise in this. How will we report from what's going on in China? It's been so crucial to the work that you yet again have done, taking this information and then forming those into campaigns and educating people. How do you think in years to come, if the current trend follows, we will be able to report from China, especially stuff that's going on the ground?
Yeah, I feel like eventually you'll get to a point where it's very, very difficult to. I won't say impossible, because the Chinese government have to. They're also, they're not going to expel every single international organization, because then it will get awkward geopolitically. Then you will have more questions being raised. So they can't get away with that. And you know, they have state-controlled media anyway, so in their head they're probably thinking, well, we have you know, international journalists, but does it really matter what they're doing because we have our own propaganda? The reason that they were so, you know, one of the reasons I predict that they were so shaken by the BBC is because the BBC released 3 or 4 groundbreaking reports that didn't just lead to better responses from communities, but also governments. So we obviously had the Genocide Amendment resolutions being passed across, you know, a lot of the IPAC countries, and obviously here in the UK as well. And a lot of our evidence was used from those documentaries, and that's what probably triggered them. And so, you know, there's a fine balance between ensuring that you are, you know, reporting about what's going on and then producing the level of groundbreaking work that the BBC have, and that, you know, that doesn't mean that either is less valued than the other. It just means that both provoke a different response from the government, and that's what we saw with the BBC. So I think eventually it will get to that point where it's very difficult to, because we're learning more about the Uyghur genocide, and you know, it's not going to stop anywhere anytime soon. I think that journalists will have to continue using the methods that they're using. So things like Twitter, Signal, getting news out, social media is going to be really important, because as correspondents, as journalists, as foreign journalists, they can have their Twitter accounts and use them. And we know that's a different case for a lot of people in China. So all of those things considered, I feel like that will be the way forward. It will continue to be. And we've seen it time and time again, you know, when issues have occurred where, you know, the Chinese government are cracking down on journalists, they'll still use their Twitter profiles to work and to produce what they're going to produce. And they're going to react regardless of whether we produce documents or articles or radio interviews or reports. They're going to have an issue with it, because we are, you know, journalists are revealing what they're doing. And the world is now responding, and campaigners and grassroots activists are demanding responses. So it's not going to go away anytime soon. What we can do better to support journalists is, you know, follow them, share their work, platform their work, and support them in, you know, getting this information out, because they obviously work incredibly hard too. And the best thing we can do as campaigners is use their information and disseminate it and utilize it as best as possible, so their work isn't in vain. And while they're being silenced or attempted to be silenced, we continue to, you know, sort of raise the volume internationally. The Chinese government can't silence all of us, you know, from across the world, as much as they might try. So that's how best we can also support them. And I think that's something that we'll have to just keep monitoring. But yeah, I mean, I think people have seen this for a long time coming. I think it hits home slightly differently when you know it's the BBC, because that's very British and it's so accessible for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree more, and I think one of the things that I've particularly got out of this week is being aware of the position, how lucky we are, you know, to be sat here. We all face our own challenges, but one thing that we can say, at least in our own experiences, is that we're able to sit and have these conversations. And there's so many individuals, outlets that don't have that privilege, but do so anyway. You know, it's the video we had from the Somali Journalist Syndicate, where their president was talking about journalists being killed, arrested, kidnapped, you know, being offered bribes, bombs going off around their offices, you know, and still they report stories. With all of those threats, they still report stories. And I think that that's the one thing, you know, particularly that I've taken out of this week, has been that we have not only the ability but the responsibility to talk about this stuff and share these stories and platform these individuals who are being brave and sharing their stories, and that even more so with whistleblowers, because the stakes are so high. Yeah. Often it's incumbent on us to be able to share their stories.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. It's up to us to use the privilege and the freedom that we have and the liberties to be able to do those things. I mean, we see the most ridiculous sort of crackdowns on, you know, Hong Kongers, for example, right? Because the national security law is so draconian. And one thing I always say is what I learned from that situation, seeing that unfold, is that we can choose to be activists and students, or activists and our normal self, and we're not really subject to anything here in this country. As bad as things might get, it's never going to be to that level, or we can at least say that for now, of course. So what can we do with that power, and then how can we keep platforming people? And that's why, you know, we always refer to these reports. I always refer to the BBC reports on Cotton and the rape and torture revelations, and the camps and all of that stuff, because, you know, no matter how hard they crack down, this information's out there now forever, and we all have copies of it, and we all are using it. And you know, it's a bit of a way to kind of show one up on the Chinese government. You know, we're not going to stop using that information just because you banned the BBC. It's not going to stop the BBC doing their work either. So I think all of that is really valid, and yeah, like supporting journalists from all across the world. I mean, you know, the video that you did with the syndicate, that was so moving and great to see, and it's a really good reminder of the fact that we are super privileged, and we need to do more things like that to try and get their word out, and so people can see the great work they're doing and appreciate it, because it is something to be appreciated.
Yeah, and we have power as individuals. You know, there are so many incredible movements, there's so many incredible organizations that are out there that galvanize people, bring people together and strategize and plan. But as individuals, with the platforms that we all have, whether it be your social media platforms or in conversations with friends and family, we all have that power to share that information and to try and defend these aspects that underpin democracies. And, you know, we're not perfect. I think you mentioned the Press Freedom Index. I think the UK ranks 43rd on the Press Freedom Index, which I think might surprise some people. You know, it definitely surprised me. There are some, I'd implore everybody to take a look at the Press Freedom Index, because there are definitely some countries on there that are above us that surprised me, and it shows how much work there still is to be done.
Yeah.
So I mean, Jay, unless you had any sort of final thoughts about you know, the whistleblowing journalism or the things that we've discussed, or anyone had any other questions?
Have a look at the World Press Freedom. You know, they have like a paragraph that they normally put.
Yeah.
So I'm actually just going to find that on the UK. So that'll be quite interesting to see what their sort of explanation of that is.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest impactors on or one of the biggest factors for the UK in terms of bringing us down the table was Julian Assange's detention.
A detention of WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. 2 years after the killing of journalist Lyra McKee, journalists covering paramilitary activity and organised crime in Northern Ireland remain at serious risk. The establishment of the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists was established July 2020. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that, you know, it's so 33 in 2021's World Press Freedom Index. We've moved up 2 from last year.
33 was it? Yeah.
That's not a exactly a great rallying call. And
no.
Proud of.
Interestingly, the countries that rank highest, particularly some of the Scandinavian countries, and we touched on this in some of our other events, are the ones that have media literacy courses in schools. And I think that, you know, our discussions almost always come back to education, but one of the things that's imperative in this is that we have a society that understands the value of a free press.
Absolutely.
You know, and how to interpret that information.
That's what I think comes down to, because if you value your free press and the role of the media, literacy education, media literacy education is so important. And then, you know, how you see media and how you see your journalists is also equally as important. And I think that that's something that the UK has a lot to work on with. And it would be great to see, you know, I can't see many parliamentarians from any of the parties really, or at least the main ones, having an issue with that. I think it's just something that's just not on their agenda. So maybe something that we need to do.
Well, the you know, our guest on our first panel, Matteo Bergamini, who's the founder and CEO of Shout Out UK, who are the secretariat of the APPG on political literacy, and one of the things that they're campaigning for is political and media literacy in schools, particularly around social media. They do great work. So you know, there are movements in this area, but I mean, as you know, it takes oftentimes you know, years to get anything passed through Parliament. So it's a good start, but you know, you would have thought in this day and age that would be one of the underpinning fundamentals nobody would really argue with. We need to be teaching young people how best to consume the information that they're getting, because we're getting so much information all the time.
too much.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there is so much information. One of the things, again, coming back to whistleblowing journalism, is that these are oftentimes incontrovertible sources. You know, these are videos that have come straight from source. Those videos of the airstrikes that killed civilians were recorded by the very people that conducted those airstrikes. You can't argue against that evidence. And when there is so much misinformation, when there is so much doctored or false footage, I think it's important that we are able to recognize the value in those kinds of sources, and then we can judge for ourselves what we take away from that. You know, if people still think that that's okay, then fair enough. That's all part of the free, fair, open exchange of information and discussion. But it's about having the ability to look at those sources. It's in the public interest, and that's, you know, the fundamental underpinning of journalism is the reporting of things that are in the public interest.
I agree. Yeah, I agree completely.
Brilliant. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's it's really great to see outlets like Demographica and other media outlets come out and be headed by young people, because we can sort of shift the direction of the way things are going. And that's what we need more of. We need more people to feel like they can join the movement and work towards something tangible. And I think people will hopefully see that as Demographica grows and yet again grows, and continues to bring on more people, and hopefully work on that area, because free press is it's one of the most essential pillars in the functioning of a democracy, in upholding human rights, and that we cannot afford for it to be destroyed in the way that unfortunately many other things have been destroyed. So that's onus is sort of on us now to take that step.
Yeah, for sure. And to leave it on like you have on a positive, and thank you for what you said about DGN, and I'll say the same about you guys do such incredibly important work. There are so many young people that want to get involved in making journalism better, in having better conversations, in doing better work, and through having those conversations, I'm left with nothing but hope that the future is going to be better. So there's a lot of challenges that we face, but there's a lot of people who are willing to pick up the responsibility of facing those challenges head on. And I think that's a nice place to leave it, unless you had any final thoughts.
No, love it. That's perfect.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. I really appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of the presentation and the discussion. If you're interested in the last 2 days of our events, we have a live tomorrow at 10 on our Instagram. That'll be on the DGN, at DGN official _ and at Yet Again UK Instagram pages, and a live and an event on Sunday. So be sure to sign up to the event on Sunday evening. The information will be out on our social media pages, and attend our lives. And thank you again, so much for joining. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.